All right, guys, I'm here with Ben Braddock. Ben at Graduated Ben on Twitter. Ben is the commissioning editor at IM 1776 and just a stalwart of a figure on Twitter. Ben, you've got like a million followers or something like that, right?
No, about 7% of that.
Oh, okay.
I think
Um,
we're around 78, 79K. It's actually kind of annoying. I wanted to be right there at 76 because it would match the IM 1776 in my bio, but then Elon replied to one of my tweets and I got a bunch of hanger-ons from that. So I'm gonna have to go through and start blocking people again.
just do a series of soft blocks to prune out the stragglers.
Well, yeah, I could do that. My other way of doing it, though, is I try to post like increasingly deranged content, but the problem is that just attracts more followers.
Yeah, yeah, that's funny. When did you first get on Twitter?
It's back during back in like 2015 during the original Republican primaries. I had a much smaller account then. I've been through a few accounts since then. I kind of jumped off, jumped back on, that sort of thing. So,
Is this your, is
uh,
this your, is this the biggest account you've had so far?
oh yeah, yeah. I think the next closest to it would be about 12,000 followers. That was a very cozy one.
Yeah, I think I remember
So,
one of those. I first like got we were talking about this
uh,
before. I started getting on Twitter in somewhat earnest back in um the pandemic times. I think when a lot of people did. All right, no, you know what? Actually, I think it was 2019, just before the pandemic. But in any event, I remember running to you on there. But so, like, for people that are not super involved in Twitter, I think people have started to get a general understanding that a lot of the, discourse that comes from Twitter ends up in more mainstream media outlets. What what's your take on that kind of dynamic? Like how Twitter influences whether it's political rhetoric or Tucker Carlson's show famously included a lot of ideas from Twitter. How would you?
yeah, so I'd say that Twitter, it doesn't really have a broad user base like reflective of the country as a whole. It's more concentrated among I'd say the professional classes. I mean, there's obviously people from every walk of life on there, but just in terms of sheer number, uh, everybody who works in politics professionally, people who work in the press, like it's the main social media platform um, that that people in these different milieus use. So it kind of has an outsized influence. It's you don't get as lost among the noise as you would on, like, let's say you started an account on Facebook and just started posting, like that's just posting into the void,
Right.
among the masses, and you're probably not going to attract much attention from uh, media or other, as you would say, elite cadres.
Right.
So I think Twitter, um, for all of its ups and downs, I think it's head and shoulders above any other platform in terms of a person's ability to get ideas into kind of the mainstream or the larger institutions. Although it's kind of shifted because I think now, actually, in a sense, the traditional media has lost a lot of its attention. Like you compare 2016 to uh, today, right? The primary coverage is totally different. Like the primary is largely being fought on Twitter. Back in 2016, the candidates all had like massive uh, groups of reporters following their buses and all of this sort of thing.
Hmm.
Now, and I think because of the traditional news model has fallen on such hard times financially, we've lost a lot of that, in-person reporting, and the big organizations, they're just not making those investments. So seen a huge shift over into independent media. I think in the last 8 years, that's really changed the way that national politics is reported now.
Yeah, it's lately in Nashville, there've been a kind of a collection of talking points, I guess, that have emerged, and they mostly emerged from Reddit. And I was just kind of thinking about the difference between like Reddit and Twitter and why Reddit is the way that it is. I mean, if you go on the Nashville Reddit page, and I'm sure this is probably the case for most cities, I mean, there's no cross-breeding with any oppositional views. It's like designed in such a way that it's very, cut off from any sort of random collisions you could have, like you would maybe on Twitter, which is just kind of this chaotic network where you may tweet something and it ends up Elon Musk responding to it. That kind of thing just doesn't happen on Reddit, and I think
Yeah,
that
Reddit is kind of is kind of ghettoized by design, into the subforums.
yeah, yeah.
So, things don't really have a chance to get out of their category and spread across the platform, unless it goes really big and it ends up on the main page. But also, Reddit has had probably more moderation and censorship than just about any platform I can think of. And so, anything that goes against the liberal orthodoxy of the day just gets completely shut down. Hey, are you on mute?
Oh yeah, wow. Just talking that whole time.
I thought it was my connection.
What I was saying is recently in Nashville, there's been like an issue that's emerged on Reddit is this. We've had a bunch of baristas strike all across town, and they've taken out one of my favorite coffee shops. And they're demanding like standard union stuff. They're trying to unionize. And if you go on Reddit, there's just breathless endorsements of the effort. It's kind of just general pro-union sentiment that doesn't really consider the particulars of unionizing baristas might be something that just financially doesn't make a whole lot of sense for like a local coffee shop whose margins I imagine are pretty small. Like they're calling this guy that owns one coffee shop in town, like greedy Mr. Krabs and like all these really just kind of cringy things. But I don't know. I was thinking about that lately, and Twitter. I don't know. It's the crossbreeding of it. I think it's what it makes it what it is. Like I've met, I met you on Twitter. I've met quite a few people on Twitter at this point, just kind of by happenstance. I don't really know how it happens. It just kind of, it's more conducive to that. I've gotten jobs through Twitter, and I'm not sure. I guess LinkedIn, but no one goes on there. But yeah, well, what's so you've been talking a lot about you're it seems like you're supporting RFK for president. Would you put it that way?
I would definitely like to see him as the Democratic nominee. Let's put it that way.
Gotcha. What do you think is most attractive about his platform?
Oh man, I had a conversation with my dad the other day. He's been listening to a lot of the RFK interviews lately, and he's like, it's crazy. He says everything you've been saying for like the last 4 years.
Yeah.
So, it's like, where do you start? But who else is talking about like 5G and Wi-Fi radiation, and he gets into the esoteric health stuff.
Yeah.
And that really appeals to me because I've been since it's been like 3 or 4 years. I've been trying to get the Republicans to take up health as an issue and environmentalism, which has been left on the table now that the left focuses exclusively on carbon. There's very little discussion of water pollution, air pollution, what we're putting on the fields, all of this stuff. And we have a real health crisis in the country. I mean, immigration is widely seen by the dissident right as being like the top issue. And I wouldn't really dispute that because the open border situation is definitely causing major problems. But I think at the same time, and the demographic thing, that's a problem too. The trends that it's changing, and America just may become a population like a nation just totally different than what it's been historically.
Right.
But I think when you look at the state of people's health, including people who their families have been in this country for centuries, it's like we're a couple generations away from like a Children of Men type situation, or Wall-E, the great Pixar movie, where people are just too unhealthy to produce healthy offspring, and we just kind of lose the unique American race to seed oils and diabetes.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see him especially bring up obesity. And I remember seeing you mention that, and it seems to me, and I agree with you on so much of this, and I think kind of following you over the years has made me realize how kind of important and crucial these health issues are, not just about environmental toxins, but about, I mean, the main one being obesity for me. It seems like a lot of stuff is downstream from obesity, ballooning health costs, infertility issues, stuff like that. But yeah, to see a presidential candidate like center something so obvious and straightforward. Why does the U.S. have vastly more obese citizens than anywhere else in the world? It's a very simple, consequential question that if you dig into it, I mean, it opens up the discussion for tons of issues. Like,
and chronic disease. We have
yeah, yeah,
4 in 10 Americans have 2 or more chronic diseases. 6 in 10 Americans have at least one chronic disease. And we consume more pharmaceuticals than any other country in the world,
yeah,
but we're also like the sickest country in the world.
yeah.
And I think the other thing to do with this is like a sick uh, public creates a sick sort of politics and culture,
Hmm.
right? Like the reason I think we're seeing a lot of just the sheer insanity with a lot of these issues is I think people are actually mentally deranged because of a lot of these health disorders. And environmental toxin exposure and all this sort of thing. And, RFK has brought up, I think, what's one of the key issues with the whole quote unquote trans kid phenomenon, which is that atrazine in the water supply has been reliably shown to induce chemical castration of male frogs, and cause change in reproductive behaviors, infertility, all of this sort of thing. And you kind of have to wonder, like, is there a biological element to this? Like, are we seeing this higher up the food chain? We've seen it, in lower order species. So it's like, is there something in the food or water supply that's actually causing this lack of gender dimorphism? Even if someone doesn't go like full trans, even if they're heterosexual, all that, you just see it nowadays a lot more. The women look more masculine than they used to, and the men don't look as masculine as they used to. And there's just kind of this convergence towards this asexual mean. That it's I guess it's more efficient, right? If everyone's just kind of the same formless blob, you could probably just make the same sets of clothes for everybody and all this sort of thing. But no, it's we see the differences, and it's happened really rapidly. If I look through my parents' high school yearbook from the late '60s, it's like a completely different world. And it's changed significantly in my lifetime.
Yeah,
When I went to college, it was completely different. And I see go on college campuses nowadays, not often, but when I do, it's like the people there, they look so much less mature than when I was in college.
yeah.
It's like there's not a guy on campus.
One thing I was going to add on to that is, have you? So I've heard people mention, and this is something I've kind of anecdotally observed myself, is that Zoomer boys are taller statistically than previously. Um, and some people have attributed this to the presence of HGH in animal feed and the use of HGH in crops and such. Sorry, my connection is. This is the worst, man. I feel like the internet used to work and now it doesn't. I swear I never had problems with the internet until you actually rely on it. Um, but do you know anything about this? Like Gen Z Zoomers being taller? Is there any do you have any knowledge of that? How what might cause that?
That's interesting. It's you know, I've tied a lot of this to in my opinion, a lot has to do with dairy consumption. That seems to be one of the big differentials. I mean, I'm 6'7", and all of my brothers are really tall too. And we would just consume. I remember my mom would buy at least 6 gallons of milk during every weekly trip to Costco, and we would just be through it, and sometimes have to run out to the store and buy more. I mean, we didn't drink a lot of water growing up. We drank mostly milk and sweet tea.
That's beautiful. There was the tallest guy that I grew up with after wrestling practice would go to the gas station. I would get ride home with his parents, and he'd go to the gas station and get a half gallon of milk and just chug the whole thing. And I always thought it was weird. And I wish I had done that because I'm stuck at a paltry 5'10". But I always joke with my parents that they didn't give me enough milk as a kid, and that's why I'm so short.
Well, at some point, you get the diminishing marginal returns, right? It puts more strain on your heart to pump all the blood and this sort of thing. There's a lot of that's been written by coping manlets that you can look up.
How tall are your parents?
My dad's like 6 foot even. My mom was about 5'9", 5'10".
Really? And you're
Yeah,
6'7". And how tall are your
yeah.
brothers?
And then my grandparents were pretty short.
Wow.
Um, so yeah, my shortest brother out of five of us boys, my shortest brother is 6'3".
That's wild.
And then in the next generation, my I've got one nephew who's 6'8" and another nephew who's 6'9", from different siblings. So it just gets taller and taller and taller.
You guys are going to be breaking through the clouds at some point.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll have to take notes on that for if I ever have a son that I need to get up. Just give him a diet of raw milk. Um,
Yeah. Well, the Dutch were one of the shortest races in Europe until they started doing dairy farming. And
really?
once they built the dikes and created the pastures, and now they're the tallest country in the world by height. And it's not all genetic. People just say
Right.
The Dutch have great genes for it because there were a lot of Moroccans who came over in I think the 50s, and they're 2 or 3 generations down now, and like the grandchildren of those immigrants are now getting about as tall as the Dutch. They're reliably over 6 feet tall.
Yeah.
So
Does that have to do? I'm sure you've read Deep Nutrition by Kate Shannon, or Shanahan. I can't remember her name. But she talks about like epigenetic expression and how diet is plays a role in which genes are expressed how. Is that kind of what's going on? Like if milk is in some way, I don't know what nutrients or combination of nutrients um, it provides you with, but does it just generally express the height gene?
that's something that's another thing that the NIH should be studying instead of doing gain of function research. Because we know there's a tie-in with dairy. And the other thing about the Dutch is they have the highest dairy consumption per capita in the world.
Yeah, yeah.
So it seems to be pretty clear. The correlation is very tight. And just my own research, just talking to a lot of different people. The one attribute I find with just about everyone who's standard deviations above the average in America. It seems to be that they drank a lot of milk growing up. So I don't know if it's that, but milk is what you drink. All mammals drink at the uh, quickest growth stages of life. So something
Right.
about it that seems to supercharge growth.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I wish my parents had done that. So, what else here? What else does RFK talk about that's interesting? I mean, the obesity thing is big. One thing that I think he contextualizes well too is environmental uh, toxins that are leached into the water. You kind of discussed this, but here in Nashville, I try to contextualize all this stuff for like a local audience. So like one example of the way that we see this expressed in local media here is Axios has a Axios Nashville publication, and like today, for example, they were talking about how climate change has increased the number of mosquitoes or the number of days friendly to mosquitoes in Middle Tennessee because of, warmer summers, more humid summers, etc. And like that it's frustrating to see the environment reduced to this like one metric, which is like the average temperature above uh or I don't even know what is it trying to cool the earth to like by 1.5 degrees Celsius over the next 50 years, something like that. I mean, it's insane to even consider that we would try to address the earth and everything that we do with regards to the earth through this one tiny metric that
Yeah. Well, the thing about it is, I certainly think that the climate is changing. I think it would be bizarre for it not to be changing because if there's evidence in the geological record, pretty clear, even just the historical record, that the Earth has gone through some really significant changes in climate throughout its geologic history. And, we had a little ice age back, I think, around 700 or something like this. I've hunted I went boar hunting once in southern Germany, and that region around the Black Forest. Today, you can't grow wine grapes there; it's too cold.
right.
Even with our hybridized varieties and all the advances we've made in viticulture, it's too cold there. But this mountain where we went boar hunting at, there were these terraces cut into the mountain, and I asked the guy I was with, I was like, what is this? And it was evident that it was really old, but it was really well built because it's just been maintained, like these big stone terraces. It was like, oh yeah, the Romans used to grow vineyards here, and they cut these terraced vineyards into the side of the mountain. It was just much warmer back then in that part of Germany. So, uh, that that's just a fact that climate has changed throughout history,
Yeah.
and it's a pretty normal thing, and humans have adapted, even though at times it's cut our numbers down really low. But there's a account I follow on Twitter and on his blog. I started following him during COVID because he had some of the most fascinating insights into what was happening, how things like wastewater being used to not wastewater, municipal sewage being spread on cornfields throughout the Midwest
Hmm.
caused massive outbreaks of COVID and caused COVID to get into the deer herd. Because he was one of the first people to pick up it. It actually, when it's shed and when the virus is shed in sewage, it can remain there much longer than let's say the air. And you spread this stuff on the fields, and it gets into the water supply. All of this, and he tracked, and they it aligned perfectly. Outbreaks across the top counties where corn is grown versus the season when the manure is spread on the fields. But anyway, he's gotten into some climate change posting recently, and he showed how it's something like 30% of the rise in the ocean temperatures was in the first 2 months of this May, and
Really?
how it's yeah, and how it's not actually so it's not there's no model that can show that it's being driven by humans. And in fact, the rise in CO2 may very well be a result of the warming, not the cause of the warming. But as I understand it, what his argument is that there is greater activity coming from the core. And we know that magnetic north has been moving about 30 to 40 miles a day from Canada towards Siberia. And so with a lot of this extra activity in the Earth mantle and the all the different, I forget the name of the layer, but I was talking about it's like exothermic warming. So basically, it's coming from the core of the Earth and coming up through the oceans. And there are these hot spots when you see the data from the oceans, right? There's a hot spot near Japan. It's one around the British Islands. I think also on the coast of South America, just off of Peru. So, there's that to consider that the Earth might be heating up from the inside.
And there's yeah,
And
there's processes going on in all, whether it be under the earth or above the earth, that it's impossible for us to reduce down to, oh, the earth is just warming up due to this one thing. Uh, I don't know. I mean,
yeah, and maybe we shouldn't devote all of our resources to to reducing carbon before
right.
we've actually determined whether or not carbon is the main thing driving this or not. Maybe it's that we're just going through a geologic phase where the Earth is going to warm and it is going to cause problems, and maybe we should use those resources instead to try to adapt to what's coming down the pike, rather than thinking we can actually play God and override Earth's thermostat. And the kind of thinking, there's a arrogance about all this to me. Humans on Earth, we're like a tick on the back of an elephant.
Yeah.
We think we can control the elephant's behavior. It's pretty wild. And, another thing could happen though is we could see a volcano blow up in New Zealand next year, and then suddenly we're plunged into like a really cold spell and we have mass famines. There's any number of things could happen that would be totally independent of human activity or control. So I think we should just adopt an outlook of we're on the ride. We can't get off. We can't control it. We should just accept what happens.
What do you think of Elon Musk's plans to inhabit Mars as a way to get us a quote unquote second Earth?
I think it's interesting. I think that given the crisis of competence we've seen, though, it's very hard to pull off. I think there's probably an excellent chance that the feds clamp down on the whole enterprise before it can take off. But I get the impulse behind it. It's a Faustian spirit of adventurism. I think it's probably more likely that civilization just goes into a state of terminal decline as we know it, and we lose a lot of technology that we have now and this sort of thing, and we just go back to a more primitive existence, and then that reopens new frontiers and all that sort of thing. So I'm less focused on Mars and more focused on returning to a Stone Age existence.
If you had to guess, what would be the first technology to go in this theoretical? Because I agree with you that I think we will in our lifetime see a technological de-evolution as competence, specifically technical competence, decreases, and so you'll start to see services. I've always tried to consider like what's going to be kind of the for me, one may be the efficiency of the airlines. I feel like that's a pretty good bleeding edge indicator of the ability of a bureaucracy or an organization to manage a complex system. But yeah, air conditioning also comes to mind just as something that I think that you'll see increasingly kind of onerous regulations placed on its use if the climate narrative continues to go in the direction that it's going. Um, but any
Yeah, it's kind of hard to forecast, what'll be the first to go. I think what we're using a lot of now is like basic mechanical technology. A lot of boomers leaving the workforce who know how to, make pipelines work, and which was the big problem. We had the Colonial Pipeline hack. The system was digitized, and
right, yeah,
we didn't have enough of the guys left who knew how to run it manually. So, you have it on that end, but at the same time, we could see a something like an EMP from an intense solar storm, right? Like a Carrington effect, uh, fry just about anything with a circuit board on that side of Earth that's facing that storm.
right.
This happened back, I think, in the 1850s or maybe late 1840s, but it burned up the telegraph wires
Hmm.
across the United States, and settlers out west left their tents. They thought it was dawn outside because so much radiation was hitting the ionosphere that it lit up the night sky.
Wow.
It was about midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning when it happened, but it was yeah, it was that bright out. And people thought it was the end of the world because it was such a crazy event. I guess kind of like the Northern Lights, but much more intense and widespread.
What one thing
So
one technical area of competence that I think it is like interesting because as we see it decrease, it kind of bleeds out into other fields. It's the internal combustion engine. I think it's like as gasoline powered vehicles get kind of demonized more and more, you're going to see less people devote their lives to working on cars in that way, specifically cars that utilize gas and the
yeah,
amount of technology we've developed over the years that is fairly sophisticated on a mechanical level. And we're replacing that with battery powered cars, which if you look at like the schematic of a battery powered car, it's literally a rear differential on the back connected to a battery. And there's no
right.
transmission, there's no like sophisticated parts at all. It's a very dumb
Mm-hmm.
machine that runs on software. Um, and like I feel like swapping it, like losing the kind of ingenuity that goes with the internal combustion engine is just it's a different type of guy that's going to be working on electric vehicle, the mechanics of an electric vehicle, and
Right.
it's
And
going to be tougher.
we used to be a nation of tinkerers, but now the way the cars are built, they're built to be almost impossible for a normal person to work on.
Yeah, yeah,
And so you lose that mass base that we used to have. Back when people had Model Ts, everyone had to be a mechanic. You had to
right.
work on stuff because you were constantly fixing it. But yeah, all this reminds me of something that John Steinbeck wrote in The Log from the Sea of Cortez. He said that it's a rule in paleontology that ornamentation and complication precede extinction. And our mutation, of which the assembly line, the collective farm, the mechanized army, and the mass production of food are evidences or even symptoms, might well correspond to the thickening armor of the great reptiles, a tendency that can end only in extinction. If this should happen to be true, nothing stemming from thought can interfere with it or bend it. Conscious thought seems to have little effect on the action or direction of our species. And you think about it, like our the means of production have become ever more complicated to the point of farming just has no relationship to what it was traditionally.
No,
And I think actually more than more of a risk than a Carrington event or even nuclear war would be something like hyperinflation, which is really easy to happen, and you know would be, I think, actually worse than nuclear war in many ways, because when the thing that makes this big complicated system work is a functioning price system and ability to exchange our labor in really really specialized fields for something that's just like a common store of value and exchange, right? Like the dollar. And so, you take someone who uh, they have like a normal factory job, right? Like they make the head of a screw and they don't even make the entire head of it, but they're responsible for just one part of that piece of production.
Mhm.
when you have something, if you have an event where the money fails and you're basically thrown back into a barter system, you can't barter for that highly specialized piece of labor, right? Because you're not turning out a full good.
Yeah,
There's
yeah, yeah.
very few. There's very few workers in the economy that are creating an entire good,
Of course.
right? Even something simple like a pencil requires so many different fields working in it, right? You have the people who cut down the trees to make the wood for the pencils, but they depend on capital, right? Like axes or chainsaws and stuff. Well, the axe, you have to have someone who's mining the metal for it. You have to have someone who processes the metal. You have to have someone who forges it. The production chain, it's so long and so many different parts to it that no one is doing really a complete unit of labor or production that you could barter in a barter economy. And so if you're thrown into a barter economy, the reality is that 99% of people just wouldn't be able to uh, produce anything. You know,
The,
the
the the scariest
good.
book I've ever read is When Money Dies, about hyperinflation in Weimar. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, literally the scariest book I've ever read. Yeah, uh,
And Weimar was much more closer to a old agrarian economy than anything we have today. Like it was much less advanced.
right.
And we
Yeah,
weren't dependent on, people still had horses, right? They still had they still had ways to survive if money failed.
of course.
But how are you going to put there's no way you're going to barter for something like gasoline. Gasoline wouldn't be produced. Gasoline is too complex to produce in a barter economy.
Of
You
course.
have to have an intermediary like money to facilitate that. So, what happens if gas production just can't happen economically because money fails? You know, how many you would have hundreds of millions of people would die just in the United States. So,
I saw you tweeting about Bitcoin the other day. Bitcoin sold. We've talked about this before. Bitcoin sold as kind of the alternative to fiat currency and sound money, and obviously it's not without its faults. It's totally electronic. But what do you think about what are your views on Bitcoin?
well, Bitcoin, for me, I mean, I know there's a hump. Once you're in it, once you have your Lightning connection set up, all of this stuff, you can use it for payments and all. But I just was trying to get it set up to use Bitcoin for payment instead of just speculation the other day. And it takes forever for these wallets to like verify your information and all of this stuff. But a lot of that's just due to regulation.
Yeah,
So that's the big fight. Is like, is uh, is Bitcoin going to be able to eventually avoid the kind of regulation and constraints that are placed on it by governments, which make it just really complicated for a normal person to switch over their financial activity to.
I run my own. I mean, I don't identify as a Bitcoin maximalist, but I've been fascinated by the technology for quite a while, and I bought Bitcoin, and I actually embarrassingly, don't think I've ever transacted with Bitcoin, but I run my own like Bitcoin node at home, and I have for a couple of years, and I'm fairly well acquainted with that community, and I don't know, it's an interesting community because a lot of I mean, it's kind of like libertarians. Well, okay, it's entirely libertarian, but there is an interesting crossover in that community with issues of health and just general sovereignty. And more so than any other kind of collection or community, political community I've found, Bitcoin collects all those together the most like efficiently and effectively. Like when you go to the Bitcoin conference, it's,
Right.
everyone there has the
No,
same views on climate change that we're talking about here, has the same views on health and food, etc. Which I just find that
it,
interesting.
it's as a community, I think it's one of the best collections of human capital that you'll find anywhere.
100%, yeah. And I think
Yeah,
that if there's like
it's
a
people who are really smart, They're open to new things. They're not closed off. They can entertain new ideas or sort of, that going back to the RFK thing. One of his biggest obstacles is like people have had propaganda drilled into their brains to where any suggestion, that there could be any problem with, let's say, atrazine, right? People just dismiss this stuff out of hand. It's like, oh, of course,
They
this
say it's the,
pesticide that we were spraying on all of our corn, like, of course, this will have no effect whatsoever, even though there's the studies to back up that it's an endocrine disruptor and all these things. People just reject this stuff out of hand. Bitcoiners don't reject any of that.
right.
They're they will hear something that is unusual and they will tend to evaluate it on its own merits and see what the evidence is, and they'll go with they're open to persuasion. So
Yeah.
a lot of great qualities there. I think actually that's one of the things maybe that makes Bitcoin kind of hard to use if you're not used to it, because these are people who can handle the steep learning curve,
Right.
and they can like just figure out really quickly, okay, I need to like open a MetaMask wallet, like get hooked up to a Lightning node and all this stuff. And you know, most of us like we look at this and like, all right, what the heck is all this stuff? I feel like a boomer asking how to open a PDF.
Yep.
They're trying to do a transaction with this stuff.
In
So
fact, yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah. I come from a software background, so I was able to like pick it up fairly quickly. But yeah, that's true. The learning curve is certainly intimidating. Um, yeah. Yeah, I don't know. It's just an interesting collection of people, and I think that there's probably they don't want to engage politically. But I was at the Bitcoin conference this past year, back in March. Gosh, was it? No, it was May. Um, and RFK was there, Vivek Ramaswamy was there, Tulsi Gabbard was there. Some former senators and congressmen were there whose names I can't remember, and they were all kind of extolling, Bitcoin as the way out, the way to get around poor monetary policy coming from the Federal Reserve. And it kind of seemed to me like the political dimensions of that coalition are starting to emerge, and they're starting to realize that, I mean, they have to be political
Right.
with it. And I think that up until recently, they've been kind of naive about the politics of this, and this is the criticism that I hear from a lot of people, even libertarian types who just don't think that it works because they think the community and the people associated with it are just naive about how the government's going to react to it. And you're starting to see, you know, lobbying groups start up that are pushing for legislation within the U.S. government, that kind of thing. And I think that's one of the more interesting kind of political developments. I mean, if we're going to piggyback off your thing saying hyperinflation, and I agree, is the scariest thing that could happen outside of, I mean, the Yellowstone volcano exploding and us all dying, which I guess wouldn't be that scary. Uh, Hyperinflation is awful. And so it's good to see that, it's encouraging at least to see that there is a well-funded and intelligent coalition that's forming to try to get ahead of that stuff.
Yeah, and that would be the key. Would be able to get most of the economy switched over before the lights go out, because we still have to have power in order to use
Yeah,
Bitcoin.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, switching gears, who's your favorite American writer?
Living or dead?
Let's do both. First, dead.
John Steinbeck.
What's your favorite Steinbeck book?
I'd have to say used to be.
East of Eden's good. I liked
Like
his
about those.
shorter. I was obsessed with the Pearl for a while, and then Cannery Row is also good.
All of them are really good in their own way. They're unique.
Yeah.
To a God Unknown, that's really good. Some of his other early work, like The Winter of Our Discontent,
Yep.
Travels with Charlie, his travel log of a road trip across the U.S. 50s. That's terrific. Uh, yeah, it's hard to go wrong with anything he's written. And I already quoted from The Sea of Cortez.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, the guy was he was a true Renaissance man. You know, he could go out and help collect marine specimens from tide pools, and then draw these brilliant narratives from it about how he could see like the parallels with civilization, right? That great observation about the ornamentation preceding extinction,
Yeah.
right? Uh,
One thing that I was going to add to that is so the him being a Renaissance man is interesting, and it kind of connects to what you were saying earlier about the specialization of labor and how if a guy is building the top of the screw and not the whole thing, his in a barter economy, he's not going to have much to offer. And it reminds me of that essay that we talked about. Pietro, what's his last name?
Boselli?
Yeah. So him, like he had a good like philosophical system that could encompass this multidisciplinary attitude. But it does seem like a lot of the writers that I certainly admire from the past were generally not just writers. They always had some craft or something else that they could kind of reflect their ideas through. And Steinbeck seems like he's like that, or he is like that. He's got
Yeah,
a
they went through just kind of they were classic American tramps, right? They just worked odd jobs here and there. You get somebody like Hunter S. Thompson who would just be living in a cabin and doing odd jobs to survive. Uh, they were people who really got out and experienced life. Uh, versus, I think now you just see a lot of people they're kind of going straight from you know getting an English master's degree to trying to go straight into the literary world.
yeah.
Uh, the more successful ones are able to make that transition pretty seamlessly, but it's like they don't get to experience that much uh, of what life in America is like. And if they do, you get a lot of them who they may work as a barista or bartender or something like this. They're still in you know a handful of the major cities.
Right.
It's not just being in a city period, but it's just being in very specific cities with literary scenes. Uh, they don't really know anything of life in, let's say, Fargo, North Dakota, or even Chattanooga, Tennessee. Right? It's just I don't know. I don't see that much of a broad exposure to what normal American life is.
Yeah, some of the good, I don't read, admittedly, a lot of, and frankly, it's been a while since I've read a novel. I'm trying to think. I can't even think the last one I read was probably Outcasts of the Island by Joseph Conrad. But a lot of the more modern novels I read have been around travel, like Alex Garland's The Beach, I think of. And I do think that a lot of, and Houellebecq kind of gets into these similar observations, but a lot of modern novels that are compelling to me, in my experience, in my admittedly limited experience, seem to kind of comment on this like shallow interaction that characters have with the world. Like Houellebecq does it kind of through the lens of materialism and how tourism alters the landscape of certain cities. Garland kind of gets into like the low stakes, petty travel culture. And yeah, I don't know. It does seem like it's harder to find writers that actually have had, you know, life experiences with some depth that aren't, that couldn't. I don't know if you could describe Steinbeck as being worldly because he spent his entire life, as far as I know, in the U.S. But more, I don't know. It's like hard won wisdom that wasn't just kind
Well,
of.
he did. I think he did travel as a war correspondent in World War II and definitely in Vietnam. So he did get
Okay.
out a bit, but he wasn't. He wasn't like Hemingway. Actually living in Europe for extended periods of time. It's interesting. He had a inferiority complex vis Hemingway, which I think is kind of funny because I think he's a vastly superior writer to Hemingway.
Funny
So
story. Funny story about Hemingway. Hemingway wrote my great aunt, my grandmother's sister, a letter when he met her in Key West one time, and like you know, sent her a letter and was like, "Come sail the seas with me." Right? We've never been able to get her to. So it's another side of the family. We've never been able to see the actual letter, but she claims that Hemingway wrote her a letter and propositioned her.
Wow. Pretty
Um,
cool. I think of that generation that, packed their bags and headed off to the French Riviera. I think it would have to be F. Scott Fitzgerald would be my favorite of those writers.
have you ever read? I love F. Scott Fitzgerald. It's been a while since I've revisited his work, but have you ever read Gore Vidal's assessment of F. Scott Fitzgerald?
I
He
have not.
he hates F. Scott Fitzgerald. It's pretty funny actually. Maybe reconsider a little bit. I don't. Gore Vidal writes some great essays. I don't know that I necessarily um, agree with his worldview, but he's a fantastic writer, and he kind of has adopted the affectation of a modern day Montaigne, and I don't know.
I think the most interesting thing I've read by Vidal was his Vanity Fair article, "The Meaning of Timothy McVeigh."
Interesting. I don't think I've read that one.
It's a really interesting one. And it was they had I think a 3-year correspondence, and discussed like the erosion of the Bill of Rights and all this sort of thing. But
Interesting.
yeah, it's and he Vidal wrote this back when the trial and all this stuff was going on. So he was one of the only people, I think, who was willing to kind of step away from the typical media caricatures and try to get to the heart of what McVeigh was about, and some of the other elements of Oklahoma City. That it was a highly narrativized event, and the
Right.
narrative is pretty separate from reality. It's yet another one of these things where the FBI wanted everyone to think that it was a lone wolf attack, and you start going down that rabbit hole. It's pretty fascinating. It's pretty compelling evidence that the ATF had advanced knowledge. They had an informant at the Elohim City compound that McVeigh was living at. Carol Howell, she had wrote to her ATF handler a month beforehand that McVeigh and others were planning to blow up the federal building there in Oklahoma City. And this only came out because the ATF, when she started talking to people after the bombing, the ATF hit her with explosives charges, which she conclusively proved the explosives were sent to her by the ATF. But that stuff did manage to come out in the trial. And just that's a whole other can of worms to get into. But yeah, Vidal was one of the only people who, one of the only prominent American intellectuals, I think, who was willing to scrutinize the case with any degree of objectivity.
Hmm. I enjoy reading his essays. I never read any of his novels or anything, but his essays are, he comes from that kind of like brief period in the 50s and 60s when public culture respected had the public intellectuals at that time were just more intelligent or more willing to engage or able to engage, maybe because of the average education of the population in higher ideas. And I kind of, that post World War II literary period is pretty interesting to me.
Yeah, it's but on both the right and the left, the figures who are in the elite quarters, they're just much more sophisticated and respectable, right?
Yeah,
You
yeah.
may not agree with them, but you kind of get where they're coming from, and they seem more human, whereas today they seem more robotic. And I think that's another thing about RFK is he's feels kind of like the last of the 60s 70s style of the elites.
Yeah.
you know
Yeah. Well, Cormac McCarthy just died, and I know that he used to hang out at the Santa Fe Institute a while, which kind of also kind of a multidisciplinary guy. He also, uh, was worked as a mechanic, built his own multiple of his houses with his own hands. Was kind of a jack of all trades in the mold of this older writer who actually had lived experience. And um, so RIP to Cormac McCarthy. Who's your favorite dead American, or no, sorry, alive American writer?
Live. Uh, Man. Well,
Doesn't have to be a
John
novelist.
Didion died. John Didion died back in the winter, so I couldn't use her. That would be my go-to. There's really not many left that are living that I really read much of.
Yeah,
I would say if we could just step away from the American part of it, it would have to be Will Beck. It's
yeah,
one of the few writers who are still active that, every time a book is released that they've panned, like I immediately pre-ordered on Amazon. Uh,
yep, same.
everything else, I go to Barnes and Noble periodically and check the new release section, and it's just trash. So
I'm looking around at my books. I don't think I bought like a new novel, unless it's like something from someone online. Um,
I do like Pynchon.
Thomas Pynchon. Yeah, I like Pynchon too.
Yeah,
I was obsessed with. I feel like in college you get like one big dense book to read, and it's like you volunteer for one. It's like Infinite Jest, Gravity's Rainbow, like all the people in the engineering department where I was read Godel, Escher, Bach, and this is kind of like the defining book for your literary taste or your. And I read Gravity's Rainbow, um, and yeah, I was obsessed with Pynchon for a long time, and I love The Crying of Lot 49. That's one of my I kind of favor these shorter novels, to be honest with you. I'm not really a novels of ideas type guy. I like, just stories, like little
and
parables.
my favorite of his was Inherent Vice because it's
Oh yeah, that's
set in that time period, early '70s Los Angeles, and that's kind of a point of obsession for me. So,
I love that. I love that book as well.
and
The
I
Paul
love the
Thomas
film
Anderson,
adaptation.
the Paul Thomas Anderson adaptation is pretty good as well.
The one thing that Anderson left out of that adaptation, though, was the part about ARPANET.
Uh huh. Not I can't
And
remember that.
so, the early internet, basically, Pynchon had written it, as I remember, he had written it as being like the next stage of MK Ultra type stuff.
Uh huh.
How the and how it would be this would be seen as this opening, open flow of information, this sort of thing. But because of that, it would allow people to tap into more open flow of information. It would be um, the government would then do everything they could to control that because it's just not something that they could let the people get away with having that much power.
Yeah.
It's kind of tracked. There's still a lot of open information flows over the internet, but I think particularly during the pandemic, we saw just how strong of a tendency there is to crack down on it anytime it becomes meaningful.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely true. Another good Pynchon novel is about California, Northern California specifically, is Vineland. I don't know if you ever read that one.
Vineland, I haven't read that one. No.
If you're into the North California vibes of this like 70s, I'd say worth a read. It's been forever, but when I lived in San Francisco Bay Area briefly outside, after college, and I mean, like, I started reading Vineland when I moved out there. It was the perfect book to read to introduce me
Mhm.
to that place. I mean, very weird, used to be a very weird part of the country, the Bay Area, like just full of kind of eccentric characters. When I lived out there, uh, I mean, I lived in Palo Alto, and Palo Alto is where the Grateful Dead was started. I mean, it's where Steve Jobs famously lived, and I mean, the HP garage was right around the corner from where I lived. I felt like I was kind of like living in the ruins of the old wacky Silicon Valley, and you go out there now and it's like machined over all the weirdness and the eccentricities and just replaced it with this kind of uniform, like in every way, from the way the people behave to the stores that are on the main strip downtown. It's really unfortunate, but Vineland kind of reminds you of that
Yeah.
weirdness that was out there.
Yeah, that's something I noticed on my last trip to Austin. Man, they did not keep Austin weird.
Yeah.
It's yeah. And even when they try to maintain the eccentricities, now it just comes across as kind of twee.
Yeah,
It's done in this self-conscious, ironic sort of way. They Abbott Kinneyed South Congress Street. I'll never forgive them for that.
I mean, similar thing going on here in Nashville. I don't know if Nashville was ever weird, quite like Austin, but I mean, like Bob Dylan when he recorded Blonde on Blonde chose to come down to Nashville because it was full of talented musicians, but kind of off the beaten track, and he could come down here and be left alone. It was not as hustly and bustly as New York, and it's still not. But the town has very much lost this kind of like understatedness that defined it until the New York Times wrote their shitty article calling it "It City." Like fame, there's this.
Yeah, and that's the problem now. Whenever a city becomes its city, right? It become people find out about it. I kind of call it the Instagram phenomenon because you
Yeah,
start noticing that all those cool hidden travel spots that existed in the pre-Instagram age, now you show up. There'll be like there's a plane crash site in Iceland on the south coast. It's like an hour and a half walk from the parking lot to get to it across the black sand beach. And you're just out walking in the middle of nowhere. It feels completely isolated. You show up at the crash site, and there's like 30 people with tripods and drones and all this. It's carnage, right? And yeah, it's kind of that's the downside, I think, of the internet 2.0 age. Is it's too easy for people to put all of the cool stuff online. And
yeah,
there's this whole thing about you can't gatekeep the bagel shop. Uh, everybody should be able to know about all these places
right.
that are good and cool. And it just you get a bunch of people shows up, overwhelms it, quality goes down. And I think that's happening with cities.
Definitely.
Cities, I'd say up until about 2015, 2017, thereabouts, American cities, they tended to all have pretty unique vibes. And, they had their own local cultures, a lot of locals in them. Uh, and so you could travel around the country and it seemed like each place you went to was special in its own way. And since then, it seems like it's just been a horde of, transients just moving from city to city, like showing up in mass number.
You,
uh,
you know,
all these cities, they're all just becoming part of a monoculture. So there's not that much of a difference between, uh, you know, I'd say still, one of the ones that's still pretty distinct. Like there is a difference between LA and New York, for instance. Some of the big ones have retained some of their characteristics, but the differences aren't as sharp anymore. And in kind of the middle cities, like you take a place like Kansas City, it's just gone fully into the monoculture. And aside from a couple of barbecue joints, it's become kind of indistinguishable from any other city in America that a lot of recent college graduates moved to.
how Nashville is too. I mean, Welbeck has a really good point about this. He talks about how in the map in the territory, he talks about how tourist locations, favorite locations in the French countryside, slowly, you start to go out there, you see a Chinese restaurant, you start to see these little like cottage industries emerge to specifically appeal to tourists. And like when I was in New Zealand a couple of years ago, I mean that entire country, not that it really had any significant, unique, individualized culture um, apart from like its place in the Anglo sphere. But when you go out there, that entire country seems oriented towards tourists, and it's like that's the big debate in Nashville right now: is what's the city oriented towards? The tourists who bring in a ton of money to the city and a ton of tax revenue that, frankly, it would be stupid for the city to ignore or try to, reduce. If you're thinking about the city as purely as a means to bring in tax revenue and improve services and such. and trying to create a more livable space for the people that already live there. It's yeah, I agree though. When you go, especially in the U.S., it's like every place feels the same, and it's kind of discouraged my like travel impulse. And I can't tell if that's me just getting older or if genuinely I just feel like there's not really any.
I feel the same way. I'm like, what's the point of going somewhere, paying for a hotel? And now it just becomes about climate, right? It's like, all right,
Yeah, yeah,
I'll go
yep,
to my down to Miami because it's warm and sunny there, and it's
right.
cold up here. Uh, but I'm even seeing it internationally. Like there are neighborhoods in Sao Paulo that are indistinguishable from like upscale neighborhoods in Los Angeles or New York. Uh, Same, boba tea shops, Thai joints, like all the latest meme trends, poke bowls. Uh, and so there's this disappearance of like the local cuisine, the local particular way of doing things. Except in a city that, in some cities, they'll be really chauvinistic about their own culture. So Rio de Janeiro is one of those. Like the people who live there, they've uh, notoriously had an attitude of like, why would I want to travel to anywhere else? This is the greatest city in the world,
Yeah,
and they just kind of overthink their own things. But even then, you still see the monoculture creep coming in. But we're seeing it here in Virginia in our political culture. We just had primaries for our legislative races the other night, and it was one of the biggest um, set of upsets in modern Virginia political history. More incumbents lost their primaries than the combined number of incumbents who had lost primaries since the turn of the century.
really.
It was, I believe, five in one night. And
Wow.
the ones that lost their primaries, by and large, they were the most interesting members on both sides of the aisle. So you had Amanda Chase, who was so ultra MAGA that she left the Republican caucus because she was um, censured by the Senate because she supported January 6th, to Joseph Morrissey, who had a very colorful background as a Democratic Richmond area politician. He once wielded an AK-47 on the House of Delegates floor during a debate. Uh, he went to prison for a couple of years because he was having an affair with a 17-year-old who is now his wife and mother of his three children. He got out of prison, ran for Senate as an independent, won, and then he got knocked out in the primary finally. And it's interesting too because he was relatively pro-life, and so he was going to vote with the Republicans on
Hmm.
uh, curbing. The governor wants to change our abortion laws to where late-term abortion would be prohibited. So it would just move it to the first 15 weeks. So he was targeted. That wasn't that surprising though, because the abortion activism in the Democratic Party is still at a fever pitch. Then we also lost to Senator Chap Peterson in Fairfax County, who was the great grandson of General Lee's quartermaster,
Hmm.
and he was a consummate Virginia moderate Democrat. He provided the key vote that allowed the Republicans to get rid of the mask mandates in schools when the governor came into power. Um, he's been good on education, the CRT stuff. His wife is, I think, Korean. Uh, and so, he has ties to the Asian community in his district. And, one of the things that they had really revolted against was this abandonment of educational standards in favor of racial standards.
Hmm.
And so for a Democrat, he was really solid. Well, he went down to just a generic liberal, cutout, and that's kind of the story of the primary night. Is like the people who lost their races were, pretty interesting political figures, and the people who replaced them are like indistinguishable from, whatever national party positions
Yep.
that the parties have taken. So
An interesting idea that I've been discussing with some people lately, and just kind of what this would do to politics is, one, I tweet. I tweeted this a while back. One, repealing the 17th Amendment, returning power to the states, and then two, the big thing that I think would kind of bring out more regional impulses, just because of the coordination challenge it would introduce for donors, is reapportioning the House and like making the federal House of Representatives like 5,000 members, so that they
Mhm.
represent roughly 70,000 people instead of somewhere between 700,000 and a million right now. I don't know what the exact number is, um, but because we have similar things going on here. Like an example of a federally elected official that was recently elected here is Andy Ogles, who has kind of the affectation of a rural Tennessean and represents part of the city of Nashville. And I think he's going to get challenged in the primary in 2024 by probably someone a little more palatable to certain groups. And then like at a state level, we've still got a fair amount of characters. And we haven't had anything like that happen where, you see all these kind of eccentric guys get kicked out of politics, or get beat in their primaries. But I imagine,
Well, we just saw it at a national level with Thomas Massey, a new push to get rid of him because he didn't want to vote for the $16 million fine against Adam Schiff.
right,
For to be clear, what Adam Schiff did with the RussiaGate investigation was scandalous. I think bordering on criminal, and I'm all for punishing that guy, but at the same time, I see Massey's point of view, which was if a simple majority of the House can fine any member into ruin financially, it makes the House of Representatives an institution that only the independently wealthy could ever participate in.
right,
You know, because if your means of making them pay that fine is to dock their pay completely, and it's like, well, unless you have the independent means to live in Washington D.C., one of the most expensive cities, uh, and serve without any real income. And Massey's thing is we don't want to set the precedent. Now, the problem is Republicans often avoid setting precedents because they respect precedent. Democrats, not so much. They'll set a new precedent whenever because they
yeah,
fundamentally don't respect tradition or the system.
right,
But I at least see where he's coming from, and I think there's tremendous value to having some cranks in your
so do I.
legislative institutions. And so this push, and it seems almost just like a systemic function of the new information environment we're in.
Yeah,
That there's just this nationalization of all politics, and there's less of. It used to be that it was the local machines that ran things and the local interests, and now it's like you don't even have to be a local, right? You can come in, you can move into a congressional district, uh, get elected with outside money, just because whoever gets more big donors behind them, it ends up winning.
it
In some cases, I think it depends also on how transient a district is. I think in districts where there's not a lot of mobility, where there's not a lot of newcomers and not a lot of people leaving, I think there is kind of a tendency to preserve the eccentrics.
it's a good, yep,
But in an area where you have people who are uprooted and don't really have the local ties or local culture internalized, I think they just vote for their local people just the same way that they would at a national level. So, and that becomes a problem because our economy has kind of increasingly become this beast that requires hypermobility. Like now, a lot of conservatives, normie conservatives, they would just look at it. Well, of course, people should move to where the jobs are. Like, we should, if the factory in your town closes, well, these people should just, pack up and move away. Well,
right.
every time that happens, it destroys the local communities. I think it's hugely destructive. But that's kind of what our economy has become in this Fed-driven boom bust cycle.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's like, all right, retrain, learn to code, move to Silicon Valley. Then when the tech bubble bursts, learn how to be a trucker, or learn how to be a plumber. It's just the expectations on the part of the workers is just that, they should just uproot their lives during every business cycle to, meet the new demands of the economy instead of trying to make the economy more geared towards the communities that already exist.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I never thought about the transient nature of a not really through the ramifications of how transient areas vote versus non-transient areas. I mean, Nashville at this point is a fairly transient city. I think it's kind of always been, to be honest, but that has amplified significantly in the past 10 or so years. And like turnout for we've got we're electing a new mayor in 2 months, and turnout for these things is always around 20%. It's very low. No one really participates. The only place that there's real civic engagement is either in kind of the established wealthier parts of town, or this kind of crop of progressives that either it seems like most of them are new to town and they want to transform Nashville into this like,
Portland.
whatever. They want to
They come from Portland and they want to recreate Portland. No, I think
yeah.
the problem of the transient problem is gotten to be a really bad tendency because when things start to go south in a city, instead of engaging and trying to you know directly throw yourself into making things better, the temptation is, well, all right, I'm just going to pack up and go to Florida or some other state where governance seems better. But when you keep repeating that cycle, it's like you end up with a country full of people who aren't invested enough locally to ever make the changes. You start running out of places to run to.
Yeah. That's kind of why I never ran away from Nashville really ran away from it, but I have worked elsewhere and I am from here. But part of like the my calculus in deciding to move back to Nashville was that it's like, okay, if I'm going to spend, so I'm either going to be an eternal transient, bouncing around and just constantly moving for jobs, which doing that, I didn't see a way that I could be both productive in the way that I want to be productive, or realistically start a family someday, or even start a business. You kind of have to be entrenched somewhere to really build something, whether it's in your personal life, with relationships, or in an entrepreneurial, creative business sense. You need to be grounded to a certain extent, and I think the narrative on that has started to become that you don't need to do that to have those things, and I think that's very misguided. So like that's kind of how I've tried to anchor myself, is like through that lens of understanding that I can't have the things that ultimately at some point, I think most people want. I think maybe everyone, by like get by going along with the whole transient idea of like moving based on politics and that kind of thing. I mean, in Nashville, the people that move here just go on endlessly about transit and how we need better bus systems and all this stuff. I mean, Nashville is the number one most driving city in the country. Car ownership and commute lengths and the number of people who take the car to work is higher per capita than any other city in the entire country. And you have guys here that are trying to talk about density and how we need to expand bus access and all this stuff. I mean, they're just like insane. I'm like, have you gone outside in the city? And like my favorite example of this is there's all these. Sorry, I'm gonna rant here for a second. There's all these like urban transit Nashville accounts on Twitter, and one of them is like urban city design East Nashville. East Nashville is where everyone that's new to town moves. And they were tweeting, there's this famous park in Nashville that's got this big set of stairs that go up into the hills. And everyone knows this park. It's called Percy Warner Park. It's the largest park and the most trafficked, most popular park in the city. Like if you don't know Percy Warner Park, you probably just do not go outside ever. And this guy that's been running this account tweeted something. Someone, showed a picture of the stairs at this these famous set of stairs, and the guy was like, "Where are these stairs? I need to climb them." And I like replied, I was like, "How do you run a urban design account for the city, but you don't know where the its most popular park is?" So like it's just the perfect idea of this transit ideology. They don't even try to understand the place that they live. They're totally incurious about the history of it. They don't care about the way that people that live there have done things and how they've, crafted their lives and all this stuff. They just see it as a place to impose these like fairly, I mean, on the surface, benign reforms. But, I just, one of those things that just drives me up the wall. Kind of the reason I started doing this was a bit to kind of try to provide a buffer to that because I'm going to live in Nashville. I'm not going to move unless, I don't know, something could happen that would draw me out, but it had to be bad. That'd be really bad. So, anyway. Hey, so we're at like an hour and a half. I figure you don't want to spend all day talking to me. So, I got one last question for you, Ben Braddock. What makes a good poster? Twitter poster, for those that don't understand the question.
What makes a good poster? There's no formula for it. I think it's just the sauce.
You just have to have it. You
Uh,
have to have that special stuff.
you just have you can't overthink it. It needs to be like a stream of consciousness, subconsciousness kind of thing. Just don't overly compose the post. Just let it fly when you feel inspiration. And if you don't feel the inspiration, then just don't post.
Yeah, I would agree with that. As someone that's had not as much success posting as you, but I was tweeting earlier about the makeup of the Supreme Court and how like 102 of the 115 Supreme Court justices that have sat on the bench have been broadly Protestant, and now there's not a single Protestant. I guess Gorsuch is technically a Protestant, but he hadn't. It's unclear because
We don't count the Episcopals anymore. They're lumped in now with the Satanists, according to Politico.
Oh yeah, I saw that article. Man, that's funny. Um, yeah. Well, anyway, I just looked at my notifications. Got a lot of action on that one. So, anyway, Ben, it was great talking to you. I'm sure we'll talk again soon. I'm gonna hit stop record and then we can say our goodbyes. So
All right, great talking to you.
you can
Thanks for having me
follow
on.
you can follow Ben at graduated Ben on Twitter. I'll put it in the show notes or something. Thanks for listening, everyone.